This is Greg Canty here, and welcome to the Win Happy podcast. Stay tuned for interesting chats with interesting people about winning their lives and being happy at the same time. This show has been brought to you by Fusion Communications. Thanks for listening. On today's podcast, I chat with Professor Connell, Director of the Keynes Centre at UCC, about the new book he has co-authored with colleague Sumta O'Kane. He chats about his life, his career, the work at the Keynes Centre, and the huge topic of leadership, the subject of his new book, The Leadership Mind. When we use the word leader or leadership, it's really important that we understand what the word actually means. Let's hear from Connell. Professor Connell Fanning and Director of the Keynes Centre, a huge welcome to the Win Happy podcast. How are you keeping?
I'm keeping very well, and thank you for having me.
You're so welcome. There's a lot happening at the moment, I believe.
A fair bit. We have hopefully an interesting book coming out, and it's on the topic of leadership, and that is a fairly important topic. And we're asking people to think differently about it. So yeah, we're happy with what we're coming forth with.
When you look around us at this very peculiar time in 2022, so much going on, talk of us having to ration our heating and our electricity and all that goes within this crazy world that we're living in, you might think there's a lack of leadership around the place.
There is. While the book is not a pandemic book at all, it was a project that started long before we even knew there was a pandemic on the horizon. Nevertheless, the pandemic and since has clearly exposed a dearth of leadership around the world, with a few exceptions. And this is one of the problems we're trying to solve as to what actually is leadership and why is there such a dearth of it.
Because we're supposed to have loads of leaders out there, and when you look at them, you're scratching your head thinking, I can see who they are. I know they have titles and you might call them leaders, but we're not seeing an awful lot of leadership.
Well, Greg, that's exactly the point, really, that the word leader and leadership is bandied about partly as platitudes, that people like it and they like to present themselves as leaders and they like to be called leaders. But people don't stop and think, what does leadership mean? And in a very simple way, we can say a leader is somebody who has demonstrated leadership. But then you have to say, what do you mean by leadership? And most of the time, what we actually mean, we have a little simple test in the book, which we call the clarity test. If you can replace the word leader or leadership with the word head or headship, and it makes more sense, it's more accurate, then you're talking nonsense when you're using the words leader and leadership. So when you look at many advertisements for positions, they're invariably, while they will say we want somebody to give leadership or we want a leader, they're invariably actually talking about the head of a unit, whether it's CEO or lower down in a company. So they're invariably talking about headship because they don't actually say what they mean by leadership. And one of the things we start with in the book is that there's about 300 or 400 definitions of leadership. It's a mess. How can one work with any idea like that where there's 400 definitions?
In a way, when you write a book about leadership called The Leadership Mind, and you run the Keynes Centre at UCC, what I'd like to do is to bring the reader up to speed as to who this character, Connell Fanning, is. And what right does he have to write any book about leadership? So if you don't mind, what I'd like to do is do a colossal rewind and ask you a very simple question. Who the hell are you and where did you come from?
Who am I? Well, there are many ways, as you know, of answering that. The usual way for a Kerry man to say is they come from Kerry.
Well, that's good enough.
Which we often say is the best thing. Sometimes we say, not often, sometimes we say is the best thing to do is to come from it. But as we get older, we realise it's a bit different. We like to go back. Where have I come from? I've come from being an academic. I
But
was an
before that,
economist.
Connell,
Yeah.
growing up, were you country folk or were you in a town? Or tell me about your background and your
I
family
was
life.
cosmopolitan in the capital of Kerry and Tralee. And we were actually pretty cosmopolitan back then, much more than Cork was actually. Because when I came up to Cork as a student, I was actually shocked as how backward the thinking up here was, even though it was a university town. And when I came up in '68, you'll remember 67, 68, 67, the rock scene, 68, the student riots. There was things happening all over the world. And down in Tralee, we were pretty clued in to what was going on around the world, even though it was long before internet or anything like that. It was still the ordinary post, and we didn't make long distance phone calls. So it was radio and television.
Your mum and dad, what did they do? What was surrounding you when you were growing up?
When I was growing up, what was surrounding me was my father was a vocational school teacher at the Tech in Tralee. My mother was a homemaker. They were a generation where the woman stayed at home, the mother stayed at home, and this actually was extremely frustrating to my mother. She really was a person who should have worked outside the home. But anyway, the opportunities weren't there. So I grew up in a house where the best way I can convey it is having to write an essay once for the Christian Brothers. We were asked, nowadays it would be about identity and all, but we didn't have that word then. We were asked to write who we are, literally, that kind of question. And I wrote about being Anglo-Irish because we got the New Statesman, we read the Manchester Guardian, as it was called back then. We got the Sunday Times, edited by Harold Evans, which was a brilliant paper in those days. We listened to the BBC, the comedies, the news, all sorts of things. So to me, growing up in a non-Irish speaking household where my father was Southern Catholic and my mother was pretty staunch Northern Presbyterian Unionist, I thought a fair description of myself was Anglo-Irish, at which point the Christian Brothers took me by the ears and took me out of the room as I was a corrupting influence on the other lads in the class. So that was, I grew up, very much a Republican town where we weren't really Republican.
Yeah, and tell me the conversations around the kitchen table when you were young.
Mostly it would be about the events of the day, but actually in a very careful way. And I realized later in my life that the North and South thing was tiptoed around. Now, my mother would occasionally break out in some unionist foray, particularly around July 12th. She invariably, my father and my mother were great gardeners. They loved gardening. And invariably, without fail, July 12th, my mother would have red hot pokers all over the garden, screaming orange colour. And the neighbours loved it. The neighbours used to come in and congratulate her once again on a great display of orange flowers. But always for the 12th of July, the garden was roaring orange. I mean, I only realised later, much later in life, Craig, it was a time where there was something in the air that you knew you had to be careful about.
Yeah.
And it was actually funny enough listening to a wonderful conversation between Fergal Keane of the BBC and Adrian Dunbar of Line of Whatever Duty fame at the Listowel Writers' Festival one Saturday morning. And they were talking about their different experiences. And Fergal was from Listowel, close enough to Tralee, so in the same kind of atmosphere as I was. And Adrian Dunbar was, I think, up in Crossmaglen or somewhere. His father was something to do with the military or the police. And in that sense, close to my mother's side. And it was very interesting to hear the two of them cross over, talk over the divide and the bridge. And it brought home to me the kind of atmosphere, the air in which I was breathing in Tralee. And it was only then in my adulthood that I realised that there was a lot of things going on around that weren't said. And one of them, of course, was we weren't sound, we weren't Republican.
And tell me, in the classroom, when the teacher, for whatever reason, has lost your attention, where does Connell Fanning go in his head?
Off into reading and ideas. I think from as long as I can remember, which would be back around, always really, but certainly from about 12 on, I was an avid Penguin buyer of Penguin books, which was absolutely fantastic. And we had an old shop in Tralee, Hurley's, which was run by an elderly lady called Mrs. Connell. And you wouldn't get the likes of it today. It was an incredible range of stock that she kept. I don't know how she did it back in those days. And you could go in and browse and you got everything. Well, mainly a lot of it was Penguin, but there was Fontana. There was all the great paperback publishers. And you got stuff about the world, everything from Latin American theology to Russia to everything. So she ran a great shop. So I was very lucky in that's where my pocket money went. Every week I would get to buy a Penguin or a Fontana or a Picador. And that would be my next week. And I'd go off and when I go into school then. And so I was always interested in ideas and books. And again, for a long time, I used to think that's kind of crazy and all. But no, my life has been a book life, an ideas life. And that's what drives me really. I'm really interested in ideas.
And that path out of Tralee, can you tell me about that and, those early decisions and everything else?
Totally accidental. There's a great observation by the Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish theologian, philosopher, which is kind of bowdlerized into the version that we have to live life forward, but we understand it backwards. And that's certainly the way my life has been lived. I've never known what's coming next or where I'm going. So when I finished the Leaving Cert, I had been working summers in the ESB in an internship program. But the head of the ESB at the time in Tralee advised me with career advice saying I had no future in the ESB. I think I didn't quite enjoy the kind of work there. But anyway, I went to UCC with no great plans in mind, other than economics. That was the one thing I wanted to do. About around 16 years of age, I know something happened to me in that every year as we grew up and we had a place in the estate where we played all sorts of games, football, rounders, soccer, hurling, everything, all sports. But every summer, the teams disappeared. They were gone. And of course, as you became older, you realized the older lads were all going off to England or America, but mostly England in those days, in the early, middle 60s. And then around the middle 60s, one evening, and I can still have the image of it now, it's probably just a false memory, but I have an image of a dusk setting, and we're going home, all of us out of the street, and realizing, actually, we don't have to leave. Whatever was going on in the air at the time, there was something happening that we had the feeling, no, we won't have to go to London next year. And then I began to realize there's something called the economy or economics or business and all of that kind of thing. And that seemed to be changing such that the immigration flow was easing off. And, I wouldn't have to take the boat like my older brothers. So that got my interest going in economics. So I went down to the local library and found a few books, and that sort of planted the seed that set my direction really, but without it being a great plan, to be honest.
And you hit Cork at what age?
I was 18 when I hit Cork in 1968 to become an undergraduate.
Okay. So what was Cork like then? Was it buzzing?
I didn't think so. I mean, 67 had happened, 68 had happened, and you came to Cork and everybody seemed to be so staid and settled. We were, I think we were more radical, many of us in Tralee at the time. I can remember one of the early Irish history classes I was taking, and the lecturer, the professor then, was talking about something called the fair bulg, which my rough translation said fat men or something. And I put up my hand and asked the question. He was telling us what they were eating and how they lived. And I asked him, where could I go to see evidence of all of this? At which point he reared up and said, are you questioning me? At which point I said, absolutely not, sir. So I stayed in bed on Saturday mornings in future rather than go to history.
That was in university?
Yeah.
Wow. What's the slogan now? Independent thinking. There wasn't too much independent thinking on Saturday afternoons in 1968.
No, that was 68. It was a different world then, yeah.
Did you ever leave academia?
No, I have been institutionalized all my life. It's and I make no apologies for it. I mean, if you look at a university, one way of looking at it is a sheltered workshop, which is very good value. First of all, the inmates, we look after ourselves. We can go to lunch ourselves. We can take care of ourselves. And we can then look after other people's children. So, from the point of view of value for money for people, the universities are actually very good value. Otherwise, someone else would have had to take care of me.
So it was kind of like a program where young Connell got looked after a little bit without having to go into the big bad world.
No, it was great. I was able to I was able to pursue my reading and ideas and that kind of thing. So, okay. I mean, I wasn't ever a very good student. I make that clear. I'm not pretending that at all. In fact, I certainly wasn't a SWAT, and I certainly wasn't a good student. But I read and thought a lot about ideas and all, but not necessarily for the exams or things like that. But I got immersed more and more increasingly in my life and ideas until when I did come back and eventually became head of department, I became a bureaucrat for 27 years. which constrained me greatly. And so since I've ended that, I've had a ball getting back into the world of ideas with the Keynes Centre.
So being constrained for 27 years can't have been fun.
No, that's not true. I was going to say it wasn't. It had its ups and downs, obviously. It had its pleasures and pains. The constraint was the limited time for actually just reading, for study, for thinking, for ideas. There was a lot of administration. So, yeah, I mean, it was a trade-off, but it was a trade-off that I did happily enough to try and do something in the economics department. I suppose, again, to come back to my mother's staunch Presbyterianism, I did have a strong sense of duty. So I did the job that I was appointed to do, probably for too long. I don't think anyone should be head of a department for that length of time. But that's with hindsight.
What did you get from that time? And what did you take from that time that brings you into your current role and your thinking?
A massive experience in the sense that the work we do now, which is about personal development, which is an experiential thing, not an educational thing, is experiential. So the vast experience I got from dealing with people and problems and situations has, I think, come to fruition at, later in my life. But you have to see and understand the difference between education and development in order for that to make sense, in that it's something that's not very well known yet, Craig, and I find it a puzzle as to how unknown this idea is. Back in the 80s, and I wasn't aware of it back then, but back in the 80s, a group of people psychologists in the United States started to rethink personal development. Up till then, it had been thought of in terms of education. And when your education finished, your development finished. And these people drove a wedge between education and development. And they said, right, education is about knowledge, it's about cognition, it's about intellect. But there's something else going on with people. Their ability or their capability to make sense of their lives, to make meaning and truths in their lives. And that's not a matter of qualifications, and it's not a matter of information and knowledge. And that's a very different type of thing, and that's the thing that's actually most important. But despite that discovery back in the 80s, I mean, obviously there was people thinking about this before them, but these people in the 80s really put it on the agenda that we don't stop developing. We needn't stop developing when we finish our schooling or university, or let's say our early 20s. We needn't finish developing. We can continue developing throughout our adulthood. But they also, in their research, discovered that the majority of people do not continue developing. They plateau. And they plateau at what was brilliantly called a socializing mind. A mind that defers to external authorities, ideas, people, roles. And 80% of people do not go beyond that stage of life. And yet the world in which we were living, back even in the 80s, the world in which we were living was a world that required a higher order of mind. But people had plateaued, and this is where the issue comes in. And I think it's one of the reasons we might explore why people are turning to authoritarian rulers, because the world is too complex and they want simple answers.
In this time-poor world that's so busy, and like if I think back to those days, you spoke about the 80s, and I had a newspaper round, and from the age of 13 to 21, 60 houses would have had the Irish Examiner or the Cork Examiner at the time through the letterbox.
So you're obviously not from Tralee.
No. And every person, be it, schoolgoer, college goer, worker, they all had that opportunity to pick up the paper and find out what was going on with things. And we didn't have too much else. If you remember, at the time, we might have had the 1 or 2 TV channels. You had your few radio shows. So it was a fairly straight line with information. But now, of course, it's coming at us from all sides. And I wonder about our ability, in particular, if you take into context the work that we do in Fusion, I really think our ability to curate those media channels. And when we don't have an editor who's putting the big stories on the front page and the smaller stories on the front page, but less column inches, the less so on the second page. You go to your sports section, your business section, your whatever, environmental, so it's all curated and laid out for you. It was fairly well managed by clever people. Now they may have had political leanings one way or the other, so you had to be careful enough of what you were consuming if you were to depend on one particular source. But now, jeekers almighty, it's coming at you from all sides.
Absolutely, and
we only have so many waking hours in a day. And, you go onto your social media and you follow the things you like. And instead of getting one news piece about the stupid thing that Donald Trump's after doing today, you get that multiplied by 50. And you see very little else. And I do think our ability to compute and digest and curate that in a clever way is nearly gone. It's very, very difficult.
Right. Yeah.
So I wonder, in that respect, when someone rocks up with let's make America great again, or let's get our country back as in England with Brexit, it's like, brilliant, that's simple. I'll hold on to that. That sounds good. And it's too easy now to manipulate people because we're so scrambled. I'm not sure. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, this is the dilemma we're all struggling with at the moment. And if I change the word curate, which is a more recent kind of word that we all use now, back into the developmental language of, or how do we organize our experiences? What is our mental structure that organizes our experiences? And all that stuff you're talking about, they're experiences, and they're coming at us endlessly. But how do we organize them into meaning and truths? That's the real question that has to be addressed, I think, for the future. I think the last 10 years particularly has demonstrated, last 5 even years, does change all the time, has demonstrated the seriousness of the way in which people construct their meanings in the world and construct their realities. And this is, I think, the crucial message coming out of these people, these thinkers in America, that we've picked up on and started to use to solve the problem of leadership. That you have to separate out the education on the information side from the development of meaning-making capability. And as I said, the horrifying thing is that in a well-off society like America, among well-off people, only 15% progress beyond what's called the socializing mind, the mind that depends on other people. It thinks it doesn't. It thinks it's thinking independently, but it's actually not. It's taking its ideas from others. And of course, the social media is the swamp in which everyone is now struggling with this. So I think we're going to have to get a grip fairly soon. And I find it amazing that it's so little known, yet I would consider it probably the most important idea of the second half of the 20th century. This distinction and this idea that we can continue our development throughout our adulthood, that it doesn't cease when information or knowledge development ceases.
Tell me when the Keynes Centre was born.
2014, when I was released from administration and could do what I wanted now, and had the opportunity, was given the opportunity by the university to do what I wanted. And what I wanted to do was to follow through on what I'd been doing. I'd been teaching, mostly teaching executive MBA for the previous 2 decades with an extraordinary run of classes. I don't know how that came about, but well, I do know some people made a difference way back. But I was very lucky to have a really great run. It's a 2-year cycle, so every 2 years a new class came along. And I was really privileged that I got about a run of about 6-7 classes. That was truly fantastic. And basically we just said I said, look, do you want to come on a journey? Do you want to explore ideas and thinking? And off we went, and they were great people. And so I came out of that phase of my life with a whole pile of things not worked out, not pulled together, not sorted. And this gave me the opportunity to start doing it. And this book is one of the outputs of that. I didn't have any interest in leadership when I started it, by the way. I was doing something else, and we needed a concept of leadership. We needed to have a definition of leadership to work with. So we turned to management and other disciplines, sociology and all, for what ideas we work with. And we found there was an absolute mess. Indeed, it was worse than a mess. It was a scandal. It was a scandal that so many versions of a crucial idea were knocking around and allowed to knock around. It wouldn't happen in any other field. I mean, you couldn't do biology with a couple of hundred concepts for the gene. It just wouldn't be allowed to happen. So here it was, and it really was a scandal. And it provoked us to get stuck. Well, we needed it for our own work, but it also provoked us to see, could we solve the problem? What the hell is going on in this area that there's hundreds of meanings to the word that leadership? And nobody knew. We talked to a lot of people. We interviewed a lot of people. Everybody had different versions, but most of them didn't actually have any meaning to the word at all. They just used it. And this was one of the things we discovered, that the extent to which people were using an empty word. And that still goes on. I mean, when you see the likes of Mr. Johnson being described as a leader, the word is empty. But the trouble is, the media allow it to happen. The people play the game. And that's one of the things we're trying to stop in the book, is to say, look, this is serious stuff. Stop and think about it. We need leaders. We rely on leaders. We expect leadership. And we're in a mess. So let's stop and think about it. So that's one of the aims of the book, to persuade people it's time to stop and think and stop putting up with the nonsense.
And it's part of the problem there, Connell, that we as voters, and if you look at Liz Truss at the moment, obviously her party have voted her in. Mm-hmm. But we as voters, decision makers, we've actually lost the ability to identify what a leader is and their skill set and the way they think and everything else. So as a result, we're giving our votes for something different, using a different set of criteria. God knows what that is. And we end up with these inappropriate characters fulfilling different roles, which we do obviously hand them the label of leadership. And in truth, they're nothing like that, and the whole thing is in a mess.
Well, language matters. Words govern our thinking. So if we use words that mean nothing, well, our thinking is going to be meaningless. And what you're saying is absolutely right there, in that if you take, for example, I won't take any particular party or whatever, but if you take a political party and you have the media constantly saying X is, so-and-so X is the leader of the party and all that. Well, when you look at it, what it actually says is they're the president of the party, or they're something else of the party, but in some sense they're the head of the party. And why don't we just call them the head of the party? Mr. So-and-so, Miss So-and-so, they're the head of the party. Now, that would be accurate speaking and would be helpful. The problem, I think, what you're pointing at there is that we're prepared to tolerate meaningless words as if we're saying something. But I think more important, we're afraid to make judgments. I think we've become so indifferent or so afraid to make judgment. Now, I don't know whether it's not a feature of Ireland, but it is a particular feature of Ireland, I think, because of our religious background, where we all were brought up, many of us, or most of us were brought up with the idea, judge that you be not judged. And, don't throw the first stone because, it might come back at you and things like that. So we have this imprimatur against judgment, although in a country that is very judgmental, we can be very personal and judgmental very fast. We don't actually make judgments. There's a difference. So we don't actually stop and say, look, this is a bit of nonsense. Calling this person a leader, you have to have some meaning to the word leadership. And if you have, well, okay, if the head of the party is what you want to call leader, that's grand. But leadership is not what they're giving.
Yeah, but I presume the person at the head of the party, it mightn't be the worst thing if they were a leader, would it?
It'd be great if they could give leadership. So okay. It would. But it'd be much better, I think, Greg, if there was more modesty and humility and honesty. If they actually said, being head of a party or being head of an organization, and in other words, being a good manager and giving good management, which is we need. We need good management in organizations as well. So being a good manager in itself is enough of a contribution. One doesn't have to get into the inflation of the leadership claim and the egotistical stuff that goes with it. They're two separate ideas entirely, leadership and management, and we need both done right. But they're not the same ideas. They're not related to each other.
So can I ask you the question, what's a leader?
What's a leader? A leader is somebody who, and this is going to sound a bit facetious, but actually, please read the book and you'll see it's based on a solid argument. A leader is somebody who has demonstrated leadership, which of course only leads to the question, what is leadership? And but it is important though, because in our argument, our book is really an argument. It's not like the usual book you get in the field of business or anywhere else about leadership and all that. Most of these books, almost all the books, I can honestly say, are assertions. Somebody says this is what a leader is or this is what leadership is. They're assertions. We've actually set down systematically a very clear, coherent argument to answer the question, what is leadership and what are the implications for us about it. So it is an argument. It's a different book. It's a demanding book. It requires being read in a different way than the usual ones. So one of the purposes we want to do in it is get rid of the notion of leader in the idea that it's a post or a position, something that continues. So leadership is ephemeral. It's a momentary thing. The really important thing is to recognize it's not a lasting condition. You can't appoint someone to be a leader. They may demonstrate leadership at some point. And if somebody demonstrates leadership once in their life, that's great, twice is great. Think of Steve Jobs, clearly an industry leader in the sense that the people use the word leader. He demonstrated leadership, well, to the extent we give him credit for the things that Apple did. There's obviously other people involved, but let's leave that aside. So he demonstrated leadership on at least 2 occasions. That's quite something. He changed the world of music and how we listen to it with the iPod. And he changed the world of phones with the iPhone. And that, without any doubt, demonstrating leadership. But after that, he was a pain in the arse. After that, he was regarded as, a horrible person and all that. So he doesn't fit any idea of the image of a leader that people have. Problem for most people, which we call the Hitler problem or the Steve Jobs problem. People want their leaders to be nice people. Hitler was a great leader until he wasn't. Hitler was a great leader till 1938. Now, there was nasty things going on, that's true. But the German people would have regarded him as a great leader up to 1938 at least. But for most of us, that was horrific. And what happened after, of course, was awful. But the thing is that that's a position, that's a position. So we've got to get away from the idea of calling people leaders as if they can go in and do the job 9 to 5.
And you keep using the word we. So I know the book has 2 co-authors, and it's yourself and Assumpta O'Ken.
Yeah.
What does Assumpta do? How was she in your life?
Well, we started out when I set up the Keynes Centre. Assumpta joined me as a kind of a colleague, an adjunct, and we started exploring transformative thinking as we were doing, and ran into the problem of we needed a concept of leadership for our idea of the leadership mind. And we ran into this problem. We got stuck in the project. We thought it'd be 6 months, then we thought it'd be a year, then 2 years. It's turned out to be a 5-year project that has, I think, solved certain problems. So Assumpta is an occupational psychologist, a really brilliant practitioner working with people. So I suppose if you put it together, I was coming from the ideas, the colder logic, let's say, the colder logic side of things. Assumpta was coming from the people and the experience side of people. And we had a great dialogue. I've been lucky in my life as an academic. I mean, if you're interested in ideas, there's nothing better than having a great conversation with someone about ideas. And I've been lucky in my life to have had 2 major dialogues with people. One was my predecessor as Professor of Economics, David O'Mahony, around the ideas of Keynes, and we wrote a book out of that dialogue. That went on for about 10 years, just talking about Keynes, having a conversation, exploring it, shaping our own ideas, getting away from other people's thinking about it. And that was one of the greatest experiences of my life. And then I've been lucky that, for the last 7 years, I've had a dialogue around transformative thinking with Assumpta. And as well as that, there's been a few other people. There was a philosopher, Garrett Barton, and some other people that these conversations are really special things if you're interested in ideas. Anyone should be so lucky to have had as many as I've had. And I feel very privileged that I had these people in my life for this conversation.
And the Leadership Mind is a program that runs in the Keynes Centre as well. Yes, so do these things work together, or are they separate, Connell?
Oh no, they work together. I mean, we've developed a number. See, I'll reverse back a bit, Greg.
That's okay.
We started to work with the ideas of this chap, Robert Keegan. Now, as I mentioned earlier that there was people who were rethinking development, and he was one of them. He's not the only one, but he's the one that connected with us in terms of his writings, and as well personally as a very good friend when I was head of the department and subsequently. So we connected with his ideas, and he's definitely, without doubt, one of the most important thinkers of the last quarter of the 20th century. And yet, even in educational areas, people don't know about him or anything. So I find this absolutely fascinating. But anyway, so we work with his ideas.
What makes him so important?
Because he worked out that he was one of the people who worked out, but he worked out a very good explanation of the difference between education and development, and that development can continue all through your life because it's about how you process experiences, because it's about how you organize your experiences into meanings and truths. And in that way, we construct our own realities. Because he really developed that theory very well, he's probably, as I said, I would consider one of the most important thinkers at the end of the 20th century. His ideas should revolutionize every area, from CEOship to training teachers.
And even that idea, because we all do our college courses, or in my case, my accountancy courses.
Yeah.
Before you know it, you're in the thick of business and you progress up the professional ladder, as well as your life changing, at different phases and everything. And it's all busy, isn't it? We don't have time to...
Yeah.
You do your best, I guess, to self-educate. Obviously, some people will do the MBAs, but I've heard you saying as well, this isn't an MBA either. This is that continuous thinking and development that happens after.
See, I think the important thing is to get a grounding in the distinction between education and development. And education is obviously very important. But I think the thing we miss is that in our early years, and that's up to our early 20s if we go to university and all. The education process carries the personal development process. The personal development process is encompassed in the education process and is carried by it, right? And therefore, we don't pay attention much to it. Now, you can see where attention is paid to it, though, if you have a youngster in a school and the teachers are observing that this, youngster isn't developing. Now you suddenly hear the word developing come in, and they're sent off to talk to a special needs teacher or do something like that. So it slips in that way. But we let education, parents, we let education carry the development of our children through to a certain stage. Now, when that ends, the presumption is, well, we're done with education, we're done with development, subject to doing a little bit of lifelong learning type stuff or adult education stuff or an MBA even like that. The problem is they are different things. So in the education process, we have been developing the capability to organize the experiences we're having into meanings and truths for ourselves. But we don't see it that way at that stage. We see it as information, knowledge, exams, all that sort of stuff, qualifications, skills. Then it stops, and in our mid-20s to say mid-30s, we're starting to get busy in careers and we're doing all that. Now, the next big thing about all of this is that when people plateau at the socializing mind is usually around their mid-30s. And that's the very point they should be looking to move on. If you accept the idea that development can continue throughout your adulthood, the mid-30s around there should be the period you're beginning to push yourself out again, right? Few people go beyond socializing mind before they're 40. That's what the research shows. But you could start pushing yourself out. The trouble is, as you indicated there, Greg, is that's the period where we're getting married, we're having children, we have mortgages, we're focusing on the career. Everything is coming together in that critical decade of the mid-30s to the mid-40s. And then when that's all over, now we've plateaued. I think one of the reasons is, actually, you see, because so people know about it. This is the extraordinary thing, and that's why I keep emphasizing that. Like, this is a revolutionary idea, and yet so few people know about it.
Like, can a 57-year-old buy this book, can they? And
absolutely,
it works for them. Can a 67-year-old?
Absolutely. What age?
A 67.
Absolutely. You see, as C.S. Lewis said, it's not the book, it's how you read it. You see, okay. If you read a book for information, yes, that's one thing. But if you read the book for the implications for yourself, for your own development, for how I think, and that's how to read a book, any book. What are the implications for me and how I think? And once you ask that question, now there's a dynamic happening. There's something happening to you. And that can develop a momentum. And the age doesn't matter. I mean, the age matters, obviously, in the sense that people may say, oh, it's not worth my while at this stage of my life, which is kind of sad. Or they may be tired, or they're very settled in their ways. I mean, obviously, age matters in that way. But age doesn't matter in terms of the ability, the potential to continue growing, developing one's meaning-making capability. No.
Well, that sounds very hopeful.
Could I just jump in there and say that's actually a very important point about it. It's hopeful. This work has good and bad in it. The very good side of it is that continuing development in adulthood is not about education, qualifications, exams. It's not about genetics and hereditary. It's not about that. It's about organizing experiences. But the problem is we plateau in developing our capability to do that. So there's the good and the bad. Most people plateau at the socializing mind, but they needn't. So there's good and bad in this story.
And maybe, Connell, maybe social structures put a framework of plateauing in front of you. You know, you're 55, you're 57, you're 60, you're 5 years from retirement. So you start to plateau and you start to do a little bit of a countdown, which I think isn't very helpful.
Yeah, and ironically, Greg, at the very age when you have a lot of experience, under your belt on which to develop your meaning-making capability. Because remember, it's about how we organize our experiences. You have to have the experiences first. You have to have a life of experiences to organize them into meanings and truths. So at a very point where people have a large amount of experience, they're walking away from it.
Yeah.
And companies are throwing out people at that age, and yet they're losing, instead of developing everybody to go higher up the trajectory of development, they're throwing out people because of biological age.
And attitudes towards that biological age. Yeah. You hear this particular line, male, pale and stale. Now, obviously,
Yes.
there's race and there's gender thrown into all of that stuff. But that stale word in particular, you'll find the young bucks looking at you thinking, yeah, you're kind of old now, forget about it. You're less relevant. My God, if you're going to ignore that bank of experience, and if you say, well, not only is it a bank of experience, but it's a bank of experience that continues to develop and continues to be applied with this big bank of experience, and experience as opposed to, technical knowledge or whatever.
That's right,
That's a very powerful arsenal, isn't it, to bring to any business, any organization, any cause, whatever that looks like.
When you were talking there about the biological age, and all, we were talking about it. It reminds me of Immanuel Kant, the philosopher's point back in the 18th century, about grown-up adults. We tend to call a person an adult after they're 22, 21 years of age, whatever. Forgetting, of course, that latest research shows the human brain does not begin to settle down until it's 26, and yet we call 18-year-olds adults and we give them guns to shoot people and things like that. But, we call adults by their biological age at 24, 25, you're an adult, etc. So Kant made the distinction, though, about a grown-up adult. You might be biologically counted as an adult, but are you a grown-up adult? And that's a distinction that comes into this continued development. A lot of people are not grown-up adults.
So could I say that this book is for anyone who wants to continue with their personal and leadership development?
Yes, very definitely. I mean, it does many things. I mean, the book seeks to do many things. It seeks to try and solve the problem about leadership, but do it in a way that shows people how to think about something like leadership and how to actually develop themselves towards the leadership mind. This is not something that a privileged few can do. It's a thing that's open. When you read the argument, you'll see it's open to everyone, but it requires effort. And that, of course, is what will distinguish people.
Where can people get the book, Connell?
I saw at all good bookshops, hopefully soon, on Amazon and Waterstones in Cork, actually, well, if you're in Cork. But on Amazon is the best place at the moment to get it.
Connell, you're on the Win Happy podcast, so I've got a number of questions for you. What's happiness to you?
The feeling that I have understood something and worked out an idea, and I realize how sad that sounds, but nevertheless, happiness is a personal thing. There's no feeling for me like the feeling of having figured something out.
I haven't heard that before in the Win Happy podcast, but this is good. This is very good.
And I wasn't expecting that question either.
That's okay. What was your best day ever?
My best day ever? Oh, I suppose the day our daughter came into our life. Has to be.
What's her name?
Sarana, Sarana, Sarana.
Yeah, and she's doing fairly impressive work as well, you were telling me.
Well, I don't want to sound like a proud father, but yeah, she's working on the frontiers of Parkinson's disease research and working to find cures for it. So, yeah, it's important work, and she's doing good work herself on it.
Could you say she's a leader in the field?
She's at the frontier, I would say that.
Yeah.
She's at the frontier,
okay, that's leadership. So this is an analogy I use a lot of the time about Win Happy. we all might enjoy doing particular things, and that's lovely. I enjoy playing football, but you can't do it all day, every day. And if you didn't have goalposts, it might be a little bit pointless.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a particular satisfaction when you kick the ball and it hits the back of the net. What's hitting the back of the net for you?
What's hitting the back of the net? Finishing a book like this, making a coherent argument that I hope will stand up, I believe will stand up, but at least I do believe it'll stand up. It works. The argument holds together. It's up to other people, obviously, to assess it and test it and critique it. But the sense that it's been done and it works and the problem is solved.
Fantastic. Connell, thank you so much for coming on the Win Happy podcast. I've got a sneaky suspicion you'll be on here more than once, and I look forward to our next discussion. Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you very much, Greg. Pleasure.
Yeah, good man, Connell. Thank you.
It's fun. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Win Happy podcast, which has been brought to you by Fusion Communications. If you'd like to get in touch, feel free to send me an email at greg@fusion.ie. So until next time, take it easy.